Madam Chairman and Senator Farnese and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, thank you for having me here today. I've always tried in the last 36 years that I've been doing this to be as well informed as possible, to work with legislators from a basis of fact. But I've heard so much today that my wife would probably say I'm really shaking in my boots because I've got so many things I'd like to say. But I know time is limited. But I think we have to put things in perspective, so I'd like to just say a couple things first. In 1995, Pennsylvania had 50 pages of laws in a book that was published by this Commonwealth. Today, the same book is 148 pages of laws. We have no shortage of laws, and yet we say that we have an epidemic of crime. Pennsylvania House of Representatives in his policy brief last year said firearms crime dropped 30% in Pennsylvania. Now, I don't think the House legal staff is lying, and they outline and detail it. Okay? When we talk about laws, Pennsylvania is the 11th most restrictive state in the nation with laws right now. That's not my analysis, that's the analysis of the Brady campaign, an anti-gun group. And yet we continue to push more. And I'm going to break this down into several ways because there's civil issues and there's criminal issues. First, we're talking about extreme risk protection orders. There is a lack of due process. It is ex parte. And there is another aspect to them because it's two different orders. The first one is the interim order, and that's the one that is issued at the lowest standard of evidence, preponderance of the evidence. And if we don't want to understand that and recognize it, the kind of problems that's going to cause, then we're really not talking honestly about the issues. I believe strongly in rights. I also believe strongly in law enforcement and holding people accountable. But if we're going to take and pass these kind of laws without concern about the unintended consequences, then we're not doing the Constitution and the oath of office a service. Because all of us took an oath. Support and defend the Constitution. Pennsylvania, support, defend, and obey. And I've heard comments about constitutional issues here. And when you have Article 1, Section 21 and 25 say shall not be questioned, I have yet to hear anyone describe why it is questioned, because we pass laws that are routinely plea bargained away in courts. And now we want to pass another extreme risk protection order when we're not dealing with people under the Mental Health Procedures Act that we have now. In Montgomery County and Philadelphia County, they recently had two actions where people that were judged at risk by a family member were taken into possession by the police, the materials were taken, the firearms were taken, and it was more than adequate to deal with the situation. Extreme risk protection orders are a confiscation of firearms bill. That's simply that. And as I said in my testimony, on page 10 of Senate Bill 90 and page 12 of House Bill 1075, the justifications for the issuance of an order are listed there. And in what world do we live that a constitutional right can be the basis for an issue of one of these orders? Because it's right there. The attempt or purchase of a firearm in the last 6 months. Our organization, the members I talk to, and the citizens I talk to all across the Commonwealth, once these issues are explained to them, have great problems with this. And I have to tell you, I don't understand where this has come from, because everything I've heard in the last 2 days has people talking about suicides. If we're going to talk about suicides, let's look at it from the pragmatic standpoint, not some billionaire-funded, biased academic study. Because I read the studies. I'm not a lawyer. I'm also not a dummy. When I look at these things, I do it because I have a responsibility out of respect for each one of you to talk to you in an informed manner, and I can't do that if I don't look at them. So what do the studies say? Well, let's look at the reality. Connecticut and Indiana have had ERPO laws longer than any other state. So what was the impact of those laws? From when the Connecticut order started till now, they've had zero impact on suicides, even though their policy has grown. The population has grown. Indiana, the suicide rate went up 44%. That's not a success story. And Mr. Gibson was talking about other laws. You know, this year is 51 years we've had a path of gun control. And I have a real problem when people, after a tragedy, a horrific tragedy, this is not zero. There are consequences to that, unintentional consequences. People die because of gun control. And it's clearly shown. Chicago, Baltimore, California, New York City. It's a real problem. California is the mass murder capital of America. They have more mass murders than any other state. They have ERPO red flag laws. They have the #1 list of gun control laws in the whole country. Did that work? Look, I've led my life working on things trying to make sure I get to the ultimate truth. If we're not going to get to the ultimate truth, all we are doing is political demagoguery. And I'm not saying that's what this committee is, but I'm saying that's what gun control is. How do I look at that way? Because if you look at what the National Academy of Sciences did in 2004, they looked at 110 different measures of gun control that were passed. This is the National Academy of Sciences. It's not connected to the NRA or GOA or anybody else. What did they find? Not a single gun control law worked. Half of them got more people killed. But we don't talk about that. It's almost as if it's passé. So let's give you some numbers about, I want to show why a perspective is needed. 250,000 people die every year because of medical misadventures. That's where doctors kill people. None of the doctors that came up here talked about that. Why? They can't even fix their own house. They got on the NRA about staying in their own lane. It's a good thing they didn't debate me. I'm a survivor of a medical miracle. I have a liver transplant. One of my best friend's wife is near death because they put the wrong lung in her. I know both sides of it. So when you look at 35,000 people.
Jim, I understand you want to share that about those individuals. They're not here to defend themselves, so I think let's keep it
okay.
Keep it focused on you and what you need to say.
The point here is that red flag laws, ERPO laws, are not going to make a difference. In my testimony, I mentioned the fact that we have portions of our society that have problems psychologically. They have problems with development issues. They have problems where, for instance, Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman talked to President Trump about this and other members of Congress. He talks about how we're creating monsters by using these drugs and not putting limits on what the media can do with these violent video games. There's things that psychologists will tell you called positive reinforcement, and there's negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement in these games is when they're on these drugs, they're very susceptible to suggestion. And it drives home the ease with which people can kill. It comes from a Defense Department study and Defense Department guidelines and training. But we're doing this to kids. The Kentucky mass murderer, he fired 8 rounds, killed 8 people with headshots. You talk to any police officer, any special weapons officer, that is not possible for them to do. But he did it with 8 rounds of ammunition. We have to look somewhere else to find the solutions. We're not doing this with gun control. Gun control is a mechanism. Gun control is fixating on an object. I want to fixate on the reasons why. I want us to fix the problems. I'm looking for solutions. Every gun owner in this room, every gun owner I talk to, we live in these states. We live in this area. We're just as susceptible to this violence. We carry firearms because we believe in self-defense. But at the same time, our family has to deal with this too. For decades, I worked in the north side of Pittsburgh. I know what it's like. Some of the worst areas. But the mayor of Pittsburgh decides he's going to violate Pennsylvania preemption law with impunity from what this legislature has passed. It doesn't matter how you feel on the preemption law, one way or the other. It is the law. And we have government officials saying it doesn't matter for us. We have a problem with that. I know other groups do too. But if we're looking for real solutions, we're not going to find it in gun control. And when it fails, who's held accountable? Who's held accountable for the killer that tried to kill those 6 police officers in Philadelphia? A 12-page rap sheet? Do you know what they call it in court? I've been in court. I've watched the criminal trials. They call it swallowing the gun. When they don't want to take and enforce the laws we have now, it's the most plea bargain thing we have in the courts, is the gun laws we have. So when you talk to gun owners and you see how they respond, this is the age of information. And they can go out there and they can grab this information easily. The judicial portal. You can pick up a person you see, null pros, null pros, null pros. Why are the gun laws not enforced? Sergeant Jim Stoker's one of our board members sitting back there. He'll tell you he's about ready to retire. He's got a full career of dealing with this. The 5-year mandatory law we have in Pennsylvania for sentencing criminals. No one can tell me when that's been enforced last, because it's not. In Allegheny County, no police officer I talk to, no chief of police can tell me if they've ever heard it being used. Why? Don't these laws matter? Why would any body of the legislature come to citizens and say, we're going to predicate your rights based on the misdeeds of people we don't want to hold accountable? Because that's the essence of gun control. You're saying to me, as a veteran, a combat veteran, that my rights have to be sacrificed because we're not going to do the right thing with these criminals. I've watched it. I know how the background check system works. We don't support universal background checks either. Why? Because it is going to lead to a registration system. It always has. California, New York City, confiscation in New York City. This isn't some ethereal thought. This is actually set down in stone. And I linked in my testimony to the actual document from the National Institute of Justice where they said, you cannot have universal background checks without gun registration, period. It cannot work. This isn't me, and this is under the Obama administration. It's right there. These documents exist. And I know that we've talked about, I've heard other things, and I'm trying to be brief, so I apologize. But I'm real passionate about this because I want solutions. So we talked about police. Where do they stand on these issues? Talked about assault weapons. Police don't support assault weapon bans. 90%. 15,000 law enforcement officers in 2013 by the Police One survey. 15,000 said no. Magazine limitations? No. They support people carrying firearms, even on school property. Why? Because they know the people that carry firearms are the most law-abiding citizens that are out there. Even more law-abiding than police. And that's clear studies out there. So when we talk about these issues and we want to find out where the problem is, how about in Pennsylvania and why the 6 largest cities in Pennsylvania have 52% of the violent crime and only 18% of the population? Why don't we flood those areas? Why don't we target the criminals? Why do we allow these criminals to go free, be plea bargained away back out onto the streets, and then wring our hands and say, oh, we should do something. Oh, we can go after the gun owners. Well, that'd be a solution, not a solution. That's excusing the way out of dealing with the problem. And that's not something I've ever tried to do, and I've always tried to report this information. And this is information we've searched it out for a long time. So, in closing, and I know it's getting late, I'll say thank you for this hearing, but understand this. We don't support universal background checks, period. We don't support any ban on firearms. There's no justification for gun control, period, because we already have laws right now that deal with it. The Constitution means what it says. I took an oath to it. I uphold that oath. And I will stand by holding criminals accountable. But until we do, I will say on behalf of my organization, don't tell us you want more until you're ready to clean the house and make sure government's not accountable and responsible for the additional crime and violence in our society. And that's exactly where we're at. That's exactly where we're at in Parkland, where government failed, and virtually every mass murder, government has failed to do their job. And if you want to debate me on that, I'm more than happy to, because I study these issues incessantly. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Dr. Finnell?
I want to thank Madam Chair, Senator Lisa Baker, and the rest of the honorable members of the Senate Judiciary Committee for the privilege of testifying today. My name is Dr. Val Finnell. I am the Pennsylvania Director of Gun Owners of America, the only no-compromise gun rights organization in Washington. I am also a retired Air Force colonel, physician, disabled veteran, and a native son of this Commonwealth. The Pennsylvania members of Gun Owners of America are opposed to any gun registration schemes, semi-automatic firearm bans, red flag laws, and universal background checks. Justification for semi-automatic rifle bans and magazine restrictions are often based on the false premise that there's an epidemic of mass shootings. Now, as a physician, board certified in preventive medicine and public health, I also have a master's in public health from the Uniformed Services University. I can assure you that no such epidemic exists. Mass shootings are rare events. The leading expert on the subject, Northeastern University criminologist James Allen Fox, agrees. Moreover, the previous federal assault weapons ban of 1994 was proven ineffective in reducing mass shootings by the government's own analysis. Importantly, semi-automatic rifles are protected under the Second Amendment since they are arguably suitable for military purposes and are in common use. Those are the two criteria of constitutional protection according to the Supreme Court in the Miller and the Heller cases. Now, ERPOs and red flag laws are ineffective, dangerous to police and civilians, and are an egregious violation of basic due process rights guaranteed under the Commonwealth and U.S. constitutions. Universal background checks would not have stopped the most recent mass shootings, but would increase the astronomically high 94% false positive rate in the federal and state instant check systems. These bogus denials would impede firearms purchases by law-abiding citizens without affecting criminal acquisition of firearms. These false denials could also disproportionately affect minorities due to the look-alike, sound-alike database employed. So any universal background check system could also very well lead to future registration schemes and confiscation of firearms. This is a real possibility. Not only did it happen in New York City, not only have we seen it happen in New Zealand and every other country that's done this, but given that 3 of the Democratic presidential candidates have publicly called for confiscation of semi-automatic firearms, it is a real threat and it's a real concern. Instead of unconstitutional and ineffective gun control legislation, Pennsylvania GOA members support the elimination of gun-free zones, where 94% of mass shootings occur. Additionally, carry President Bernstein's bill, HB 1412, will afford Pennsylvanians greater freedom in protecting themselves and their families. Finally, due process should be built into the Mental Health Procedures Act to eliminate the lifelong prohibition of firearms ownership. We heard a lot yesterday about reducing stigma and of access to mental health care. I can share my experiences with you of reducing military suicides. As a physician, I was really intimately involved with that. I can share some experience with you with that. We want to reduce the stigma and get people help that they need. That's the #1 factor. It's not taking guns away. It's convincing those people that they have nothing to lose by getting the help that they need. Article 1, Section 21 of the PA Constitution is clear. The right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state shall not be questioned. Gun bans, magazine restrictions, red flag laws, and universal background checks are all questioning. And hence, they are illegitimate under our Commonwealth's highest law. But to be clear, the statistical evidence and research shows all of these proposals to be ineffective as well. That's all in my testimony. So we ask you to reject them and instead repeal gun-free zones and enact House Bill 1412 to enhance the safety and well-being of all Pennsylvanians. I want to add a final comment, something that my distinguished colleague here brought up about the number of people who are succumb to medical misadventures. So this study came out in 2001, and it initially was 100,000 people are killed due to medical error. It's actually much higher than that. Why do we still go to doctors? Okay, right. Well, the answer is easy. Okay, the reason why we still go to a physician is because physicians help far more people than they hurt. And it's the same thing with firearms. We heard a lot of statistics yesterday, and unfortunately, Dr. John Lott didn't get a lot of time to talk yesterday. He could have gone into this. You know, we have a lot of statistics about how many people were killed by gun violence.
He did provide much of that to us, and it was somewhat his choice to answer to some of the
Yes.
testimony.
Sure.
And I respected that, but everybody does have a copy of his extensive
Excellent.
information.
Thank you so much. But
thank you.
So the point is, I'm trying to make is, you cannot, from an epidemiology, I'm a preventive medicine doc, I have a master's in public health. It would be like saying, we're only going to look at the number of people who were harmed by vaccines. And that's all we look at. We don't look at the number of preventable diseases prevented by vaccines. So it's the same thing with firearms. So if you look at the number of people who were killed in homicides compared to defensive gun uses, the Centers for Disease Control, their own data, their own research, from a study they did in 2013, 500,000 to 3 million defensive gun uses per year. That's up to 208 times. 208 times the number of people who were killed with a firearm in a homicide. So you have to look at both sides in public health. It's not just the untoward effect of something, it's also the beneficial effect. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you both very much for your testimony. As you've heard over the last 2 days, much has been said about our current mental health procedures law. And Dr. Finnell, you mentioned the due process aspect of it, and the fact that perhaps we need a mechanism for individuals who are successfully treated to have an opportunity down the road. Could you share what kind of mechanism would you be looking at? How would you define that if we were to make a modification?
Well, we have to eliminate the lifelong prohibition to firearms ownership within the Mental Health Procedures Act if you are involuntarily committed. And that goes back to my experience in the military. We could not get an airman. You know, we took care of all three branches: airmen, sailors, Marines, soldiers, didn't matter. We could not get a service member to go to a psychologist to admit that they have a problem. Why? I'm going to lose my job. That was always over their head. And no matter how much we tried to convince them that that was not going to happen, they didn't ever accept that. So we have to eliminate the barriers. And just looking at the mental health part of this, eliminate the barriers. There has to be due process built in to the Mental Health Procedures Act for a restoration of rights. So that's the thing regarding just the mental health portion of this. That resonates with my experience in reducing military suicides. I was involved with that quite a bit in the military.
I would agree. That seems to be something that has been suggested across the board. It was also, in my knowledge of veterans, the last thing that, if you've defended your country, you don't want to give up how you defended the country. And so I certainly understand that. And with respect to your involvement with veterans and suicide, if you have any additional information, we can pass that on to Senator Regan, who is the chair of the committee overseeing that.
Okay.
Senator Collette does have a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony. Dr. Finnell, on page 3 of your written testimony, there is some discussion about the research that the National Institute of Justice did with regard to the effectiveness of the assault, I guess it's the ban on assault weapons, semi-automatic firearms. And one of those bullet points says, in the first 7 years since the ban was lifted, and then one of the statistics here is that rapes declined by 27%. And I'm wondering if you can help me to understand what the correlation is that you're drawing with that.
Well, the correlation is broad. The point is that after the ban was lifted, okay, the things, violent crime decreased. And violent crime was higher during the time the federal assault weapons ban was in place. That's the contrast.
Seeing no further questions from the committee members, we want to thank you all for being here and welcome continued work. If you have information you'd like to share, certainly feel free to do that.
Thank you very
very
much.
much for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.